Oh, wait a minute, stop that.
Okay, we're recording.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to kill you all.
Okay, thanks, Tom, for coming, stepping by, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hernan, for inviting me, and it's a beautiful day in Southern California, but that's not exactly a newsflash, is it? So anyway, we actually are delighted, my wife and I, to be in California this year, and this is one of the little perks is I get to see some of my friends here in Los Angeles. So thank you very much, and I know you haven't been doing this much, so double thanks, and good luck to you and in all your efforts to get back to life as we like it. So this is a little bit of an ad, I suppose. There's nothing highly official about this, but I'm involved with a group called Spectrum X that has been funded for 5 years by the National Science Foundation to have a thing called a Spectrum Innovation Initiative. And there are about 13 different universities involved and lots of good thinkers and actually more than that in terms of the outreach and education component, but it's all about radio spectrum, mostly engineers. I'm one of, I think, 2 economists in the group, but at any rate, it's a little advertising for our program. If you want to know more, please talk to me and I'll turn you over to the people who know more. And we hope to have some can't that we're embarking upon now. So today's topic is something you can't get from many people. This is not, a lot of you are working in popular areas where there's a lot of competition. There's really no competition. If you want to be an independent analyst, there has been some consulting work on this, but I haven't been involved in anything involved here. And it shows you what happens, I think, when the outside analysts are not involved. It's been kind of stunning, sort of the way things are done, perhaps. And maybe that's a little takeaway. Anyway, there's I think an interesting story about how radio spectrum is allocated and how the process moves forward in time. There has been a problem here that people, particularly the regulators, are painfully aware of. And over the last 20 years, there has gone, we've gone from very enthusiastic allocation program, literally in the 1990s, to a verdict that there was pretty much of a failure in the allocation and should be redone. And a year ago, last November 2020, there was a redo by the Federal Communications Commission to take some of what was put aside for vehicle telematics for car communications, vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to infrastructure, and to allocate most of the band to unlicensed Wi-Fi, and that's where things stand now. Anyway, let's go through this, and I'll maybe the payoff on this as well is that the Federal Communications Commission, in allocating it, I think the process is interesting. The whole idea of a battle between 2 alternative, non-exclusive uses of radio spectrum is kind of interesting, and the fact that the FCC explicitly did a cost benefit. Did a cost benefit analysis, and you can sort of see what they did. Normally, they're not quite as explicit as they were in this proceeding, so you can see kind of the way they went about things. And I'll talk about some of the shortcomings in some of the areas. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, it's working here. Yeah. Okay. So this is called the 5.9 gigahertz car band. That's mid-band spectrum. It's fairly valuable. It was allocated what's called ITS. That's an acronym I may accidentally use. Intelligent Transportation Services, which is these car-to-car, vehicle-to-vehicle communications, also infrastructure. Sometimes pretty much the same thing is called DSRC, dedicated short-range communications. And this goes back 30 years now. In fact, there was congressional authorization directing the regulators at the Federal Communications Commission to do something to support what are now considered, cutting-edge, state-of-the-art applications. And from that perspective, you think, well, the Congress was ahead of things, and the regulators were. Don't jump to any conclusions about this because you'll see what happens. But at any rate, there was legislation saying that the regulators should maybe allocate some spectrum to support these wireless services that could help collision avoidance and fuel economies and even autonomous driving, although that wasn't much talked about then. So fast forward, in fact, 8 years, the regulators did allocate 75 megahertz. So they found this part of the 5.9 gigahertz band and said 75 megahertz is what we're going to allocate to ITS. And so that's been there for now 22 years. Now, if you sold this, if you just wrap these property rights up to use the band and made them look like, say, the commercial mobile licenses that carriers provide 5G services with, for example, you probably get about $4 billion. That's just a rough estimate based upon what other similar, other properties, other licenses are sold for in different parts of the spectrum. And but it is a rough valuation there. So the frequency space was dedicated for a particular use, and it was not assigned to licenses in the sense of any exclusivity. There is what they call license by rule regime, and I'm not going to get too much into the legal part of that, but that is actually analogous to unlicensed in the sense that anybody can apply to do the service. They have to register, which is the license part, but then they're regulated by the rules and not by exclusivity. Anybody else can register and use the same spectrum right on top of them. And as I said, it's set aside for this vehicle telematics through wireless. Okay, so as we know, there's a lot of this stuff happening in the real world now, and you have autonomous vehicles. In fact, I told people for some time, I drive an autonomous vehicle. If I fall asleep, it will drive for 10 seconds. And that would probably be a very important 10 seconds. Right. So we've had these services that have been very, very valuable, and customers, look for them when they're buying cars now, and they obviously are selling like hotcakes. By 2012, there was actually language in another statute. So this got 2 congressional statutes. It's pretty high profile as these things go, even though few people have heard of this proceeding. So there was a congressional statute that actually directed the FCC to consider reallocating some of the band away from this ITS, the car stuff, that was recognized already as an over allocation, and that Wi-Fi was doing better. In 1999, by the way, there essentially was no Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was the year of introduction by most, there's a little bit of fudge on that, but that's really when Wi-Fi starts in on unlicensed frequencies. And so there wasn't a real demand built up amongst regulators or firms or consumers for that anyway. So some years later, people are using Wi-Fi, and they're not using this band for the vehicle telematics. So that's in the congressional authorization. And in fact, the FCC does start this, and the Department of Commerce starts in on this. And we get a rent-seeking battle for the last, essentially, almost a decade. The automakers defend the allocation, which was for their benefit quite explicitly. Here, this is going to help your cars. We're going to give you spectrum. We're not going to give it to you in the sense of property rights or exclusivity, but we're going to set it up for your use. And these devices that you're going to put in your cars are going to access this, and it'll be dedicated for that. You won't have any rivalry to worry about there. And then internet companies, and by internet I mean ISPs like internet service providers like Comcast, or software companies like Microsoft, services companies like Google. They've been very active in pressuring regulators to move some or all of the allocation over to Wi-Fi. And then in fact, the FCC does this not for the whole thing, but for 45 out of the 75 megahertz. That happens a year ago. And here to me, the irony is that the FCC concedes that what it did 20 years ago is really not on the right track, and it finds very little value being provided for the vehicle telematics. Yes, we've made progress, enormous progress, but it uses LiDAR, radar, and 5G. And this band is sort of just taking up space. It's not being deployed this way. And so there are opportunity costs that have developed. Say Wi-Fi on the one side, the FCC, we'll talk about this, doesn't really talk about 5G on the other. They don't want to consider that because the rent seeking actually comes down to the car, the auto industry, and the internet firms. And so the same administrative allocation process that said, let's do this in 1999 and set aside 75 megahertz. Well, we use the same process to say, no, the actual correct number is 30 and 45 for Wi-Fi. That's it. And both allocations have this rigidity in the sense of once the rights are assigned, if it doesn't work out and people object, want to do something more innovative somewhere else, they have to come back to the regulator and get permission. And this has taken us, however many years you want to count. I'm going to count 23 years because the 99 proceeding actually starts in 97. So here's the consensus. The consensus is everybody rejects my proposal, all parties. And people say, which side are you on? Well, I suggested some years ago that the FCC that had said it was putting out the spectrum, dedicating it in 1999 for these car applications, to go ahead and invest the Auto Alliance, which has been the party that has submitted comments and interacted with the FCC all through the 20 years here, to go ahead and invest them with the rights, meaning they would have exclusivity. And the shareholders or stakeholders would be essentially the auto companies, maybe the United Auto Workers. You have some nonprofit organization that would be assigned the rights and able to reassign the rights. And of course, my motive in that is that I want some private parties to be able to weigh the costs and the benefits of a reallocation. And I want bidding. I want revealed preferences to come into this market. I don't want another FCC 1999 proceeding where the FCC defines what something should be used for, fixes it in time, and then sets up a very expensive process that might take 20 years to undo on the back end. So I say that that's rejected. You might think, you say, well, the internet companies were close to lobbying for this. I wrote the first draft of this in 2018. So the internet companies did a pretty good job on this, and they certainly politically had a lot of support. And in essence, they won 45 out of 75, if you want to say that, in terms of their percentage victory here. It took them almost a decade, and there's still a lot of rigidity to the rules. If they want to change the rules, or if anybody else wants to change the rules, they got to go back through that whole process again. And so there are issues with that. But you might say, well, they don't want to pay. They won't have to bid $4 billion, however much it is for this band. But you think maybe BMW and General Motors that are fighting to keep this, they might like it. No, they don't like it either. And they don't want to make it transparent that they own this and they can make these decisions. They'd rather, and the best analogy I have, I don't know if you ever looked at water rights in California, even water districts that could assign rights, they're owned by farmers and can assign rights to the farmers. They don't want more explicit rights to be able to, generally speaking, there's a problem if they get more explicit rights to say sell to suburban water districts where there's a much higher valuation on the water. Because why? Then it looks like a giveaway to the farmers, and they don't think in the long run they're going to be able to keep those rights. Politically, it's not going to be an equilibrium. So that's not a great explanation, but that's always the way I've thought about this. And anyway, I just won't make too big a deal. But this is an academic saying what should be done, and I'm not. Well, anyway, the fact that people, the interest groups tend not to like it, that's something I'll just disclose, and we'll move on.
So probably a stupid question that's going to show you how far I am from this field at this point. Are there good examples of secondary markets in spectrum? At this point, is it something?
Well, yeah. And so probably the interesting thing is while we've been sort of doing this, or looking at this, 2017, there was a petition filed by Intelsat, the satellite company. And they asked the FCC they have rights to use satellite frequencies at an even lower, and you might say more valuable band, 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, so-called satellite C-band. And Intelsat was using that to do video by satellite, not direct to customers, but to cable TV systems and broadcast facilities, sort of the wholesale back end, they call it. And they had 500 megahertz set aside for Intelsat. SES Astra was the other big one, and there were a couple of smaller ones that had lesser use of that band. But at any rate, these satellite companies were in there, and they knew if they spent some money, a few $1 billion, to adjust their satellites, or also put up a few more and have more directional beams, and they put filters on a lot of the receiver end, which their customers needed receivers maybe to be modified somewhat. They could actually move that 500 megahertz back to maybe 300 megahertz or even 200 megahertz. They wouldn't need nearly as much spectrum to do exactly what they were doing at that quality. And so they petitioned the FCC to do this, and they said, we want the rights. In that case, they said, yeah, we want the rights. And we want the commission to allow us to get flexible use, not just do video, because we're going to sell to the mobile carriers. That's who's going to pay the most. They can do 5G with this great spectrum, and we want to cash out. And you've got to help us, be able to turn those rights around. And there was some coordination because they had overlapping rights. They wanted the regulators to help them on that problem a little bit. But anyway, so that proposal sat there for about 9 months. But then the chairman of the FCC at the time, he said good things about it, and the stock of these companies took off. And a lot of excitement took place about how valuable the spectrum was. And the FCC was going to let them do this more or less the way they proposed it. But then there was a big backlash that they were making too much money on it. And the one or two of the satellite companies is foreign owned, and that became an issue. And so both Democrats and Republicans, a lot of Trump Republicans said this is an outrage. This is a giveaway to these foreign companies. And they put a lot of pressure on the FCC to back off. Now, at the end of the day, and it's a great FCC success story just in terms of start to finish, 2017, by 2021, this year, 4 years, start to finish on this, they actually reallocated what ended up being 280 megahertz. More than half of that band was sold in the largest FCC auction by dollar value in history. And so at the end of the day, the incumbents did get some of the money. They actually got moving expenses, which was the investments they had to make, and some incentive payments so that they do it quickly. That was $13 billion. The FCC got 81 billion. So 94 billion was bid for this big chunk of usage. The biggest bidder was Verizon, and they bid aggressively. They had fallen behind in the spectrum race to get capacity against T-Mobile, particularly the T-Mobile Sprint merger and AT&T. So anyway, that auction has taken place. Now that's essentially what we're talking about, doing something like that here. How you draw the particular rules, yeah, they're going to be a little different because the rights are different, the regulations are a bit different, and the markets and how many people you have, that fragmentation sometimes is a big issue.
And you don't have the moving expenses here. So the ITS hasn't been recorded.
Yeah, moving expenses are cheap if you're not doing anything. And yeah, the FCC actually dealt with that. We'll talk about that, but that's essentially the FCC's position, is these guys aren't doing anything. So the cost of moving is pretty nil, close to nil. Yeah. So yeah.
I was just curious, with the proceeds from the auction, I think you sort of alluded to the FCC gets the bulk of that money. What do they?
Well, that's on the C-band. Yeah, the government got 81 billion, and then the satellite carriers got 13 billion. By the way, sort of the bloody brutality of that was that the company Intelsat that filed that petition in 2017, they actually went bankrupt and reorganized before the auction. And so 13 billion might sound like a lot, but split amongst the parties there, it wasn't enough to save at least the big one that actually come up with the idea. So I think that's a problem. It's a problem for the long-term dynamic incentives of the system. Now, I never had any illusions that they're going to get 100%. And it really, if they got taxed, first of all, they're going to pay whatever corporate taxes they're going to pay, and then individual income taxes on capital gains. So the government's going to get cut in at some level. How much more than that? If it's 50-50 split or whatever, that is, that's certainly going to be negotiated. Whether it's not a matter of whether I say it's fair or the parties say it's fair. It's a matter of, just to get these deals done, you have to recognize that there's going to be some kind of, negotiation on that. But anyway, so I don't get into any of those weeds here. And in fact, the train has left the station. A lot of people would say on this, although there's still a split, I don't know that 30 megahertz is left with ITS is going to do anything for society. If you read the FCC's cost benefit analysis, you tend to think it's not much. But anyway, yeah. Was that the end of your question, or?
Well, I was kind of just wondering, what does the government typically do with the money that they're?
Well, it goes into the treasury.
Okay, so they're not really, it's not really, okay. And then I was just curious, with the Wi-Fi, I remember, and I'm not super familiar with this, but like Google and a couple of these other companies were trying to roll out like a lot of massive Wi-Fi for cities and things like that. That never happened really. Did that? And now they have Google Fi, which is kind of interesting, but does that play into this in any way or not really?
Well, the popularity of Wi-Fi usage does. And of course, we're expanding usage of wireless, both local area network, which is Wi-Fi essentially, and wide area network, which is 3G, 4G, 5G essentially. We're certainly consuming more and more, and Wi-Fi is very complementary to the fiber and coaxial cable, wireline broadband systems that we were not only using before 2020, we're using a lot more since 2020 for obvious reasons. And so, yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm about that, and that pushes the regulators to put a higher weight on unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi. But it's very difficult for them to know at the margin, is this really, this 45 megahertz right here, is that really going to have a big impact or what, versus something else like maybe not using it for this, but maybe say using it for 5G, where there obviously is a lot of demand for marginal spectrum. Yeah.
Related to that last question, perhaps, how does these decisions impact on the hardware? Does this drive development of specific hardware, or is the spectrum not that relevant to the hardware?
Oh yeah, no, yeah.
Like if Europe uses a different spectrum for Wi-Fi, would the US companies be less competitive in Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, the way an economist tends to think about it is the access to the radio frequencies is a complement, that ability, and it doesn't have to be exclusive, it could be non-exclusive, but the access rights are complements to the physical infrastructure. And any mobile carrier will tell you that before they build, there are more base stations and more fiber to connect the base stations in their backhaul systems. Just a footnote, we always call them mobile networks, but the techies love to point out that no, the network is stationary. The people are mobile. So to build out and to get more base stations and more density, right, of the access points, they will tell you, well, we're going to see what spectrum we're going to use, and a lot of that, predominantly of interest in the business planning phase, are these exclusive rights, and that's why these license auctions generate so much interest, and often, particularly in this, say, C block, so much revenue. Anyway, so they're even having an auction that's still going now, where it's fairly hefty amount of revenue for this Department of Defense spectrum that's been turned loose for 5G bidding. But then you have things like local area networks, where you have, by regulation, you have non-exclusive access that doesn't completely break down in conflicts because the rules are applied by regulation. The most important rule is a power limit. Okay, there are also some technology compatibility of things that are baked in there, but the devices that are sold to access the spectrum, that's complementary. They work, they're plug and play because they have certain bands that they can work with, and you don't get drowned out necessarily by other users because the signals attenuate. And, in a local area, you can do pretty well, and in your local home or campus enterprise, you can do a lot of the coordination yourself because you've got a lot of other devices. You might have a cordless phone on one channel. You can flip that over and do Wi-Fi on another channel and do that kind of local coordination. And essentially the property rights there are just the real estate property rights. You don't have, you have people who are sort of in control of the local physical situation. And so you don't have to depend in that application on ownership of the access rights to radio spectrum. Anyway, that may be not exactly a discussion you wanted to have right now, and we'll get onto this, but I know you want me to get through this quickly. So this is what they said in '99. This is the FCC thing, and this is looking back from 2002. By this action, we allocate the 75 megahertz chunk. ITS services are expected to improve traveler safety, decrease traffic congestion, facilitate the reduction of air pollution, and help to conserve vital fossil fuels. DSRC systems being designed that require short range wireless link and so forth. And so here's the split. Yes, all these things are happening and they're great and they have value to society. But the input, the input that the FCC was setting aside has not done this. And so you get a misallocation, if you will, or just a failed experiment, if you want to be look at it from a different perspective. So that's when we started 20 years ago. As I say, these rights were not exclusive. Any chip maker that, device maker that complies with the FCC power limits and the technology restrictions gets to put those in the market and deploy. And according basically to the regulators, it's been pretty much of a mess ever since. And I use the term vast wasteland, which most famous term in American broadcast history, perhaps. So when I say a mess, it's the 5.9 band has not been providing the value. It's been through these other technologies, LiDAR and radar, 5G, which are provided at different frequencies. And there's a lot of stuff that could use the 5.9 gigahertz very productively. And of course, the battle that I've mentioned already would be between Wi-Fi and 5G. There's other things as well. Satellite could be in there and so forth. But even when I say 5G versus Wi-Fi, 5G is not an active player in the political game on this. Anyway, for whatever reason, we can talk about that at a later time. So you did get a battle between the car industry and the internet industry, if that's a term. I should say regulators have gotten involved, certainly, and the Department of Transportation has weighed in heavily, still weighs in, on the side of the automakers. That's their constituency. They've always pushed this, and so you do get regulators involved as well. The Department of Commerce has been, I think, very favorably disposed to the internet providers and the FCC as well. And that just aligns with sort of their constituencies within the political world. So I say one consensus emerged. I already told you this. They all reject my my option approach. Okay. So I'm going to fly through this, and they're in the slides, and obviously I'll make slides available to people. And if you want to follow this up later, I've written a lot about this. And there's just different ways that these licenses help craft rights to use radio spectrum. And questions about, are the radio waves scarce and so forth. Well, just like most other resources, yes and no. I mean, is land scarce in the Arctic pole? Not so scarce. Not a lot of competition to use that. But obviously, for what's called beachfront, there's a lot of competition, and there's a lot of conflict. If you use it for one thing, it makes it less advantageous to use it for something else. You do bump into each other in terms of limiting other options. So there are ways to regulate the use of the resource and try to coordinate what people are doing. And the basic three ways that we think about this: traditional licenses from 1927 in the Radio Act in the United States, where the government actually specified exactly what a party could do to use the radio spectrum. So I think about this as a broadcast television license. They had radio licenses at the time, but that specifies that a particular license holder, usually a corporation, can broadcast a certain technology signal defined by the government at a specified geographic point and a specified height for the antenna at a regulated power level, and even has certain business rules, like you can't charge customers to receive the signal. It can be advertiser supported or donation supported, but it can't be subscription. So, and there are other things. The broadcast company can't be more than 20% foreign owned, which has nothing obviously to do with interference or conflict in radio space. It had to do with political issues in 1927. Anyway,
So do you think the restriction on subscriptions was something to do with, I'm hesitant, but like inclusion, like trying to prevent some sort of, what would motivate that, do you think?
well, maybe you should write a paper on it. I can't think of anything offhand that actually, I mean, you go back to 1927, and Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce, and he was the biggest single player in all of this. And he became president the next year in 28, but he was very adamant that advertising was a terrible thing. And you think, given that advertising is a terrible thing, why don't you allow subscriptions?
Yeah.
And in fact, there was an economic argument that Ronald Coase and others made in the 50s and 60s that subscriptions would be great. And you reveal preferences for opera and high class stuff, and not just least common denominator cops and robber shows. Anyway, we have subscriptions now, and some people would say, "Oh yes, that's why we have all the high quality stuff on Netflix." And then some of us would have to watch our wives put on one terrible show after another and say the opposite. But I won't get into that. Anyway, I do like the diversity of what we have now, which is obviously not a licensed system involving something like this. This goes back to broadcasting, but is much more of an open, competitive environment with respect to video, over the top video in particular. Anyway, so these traditional licenses are very specific, and they tell you what services you can provide, what business models, things like that, and technologies. And it has to be changed only by regulatory rulings that take decades quite often. Now that has morphed over the decades, particularly the last 30 or 40 years since the advent of cellular and the fading of traditional broadcasting, which has political attributes that kind of lend itself to supporting the old system. At any rate, these liberal, I'm going to call them liberal licenses, mean that there are exclusive rights, but they not only are they auctioned, generally speaking, and most Western countries do that now, or most countries in general do that now. But more importantly, they're flexible use. They don't specify what business model. And so when you get something like a cellular service with a phone, you have a whole ecosystem of applications that is just extremely rich with all kinds of interfering communications, but it's all coordinated because the carrier has the right to sponsor what goes on in space. And between the phone manufacturers and the app makers and developers, they figure out how sort of things fit together. That's the opposite of the old traditional license where the government took responsibility and said, this is all we're going to allow because anything else could, interfere and destroy and create a tragedy of commons. So the liberal license delegate authority to, in essence, spectrum property owners. That's the kind of idea, de facto property rights. And these are very analogous to the stuff that's used for mobile services and, generate a pretty high demand in terms of auctions. And then we have unlicensed bands, which are non-exclusive rights, where the government will define certain spaces in radio, in the radio spectrum, and say that, as I say, that here's some rules so that we all have some kind of a shot to use it without having somebody blast at high power everybody else out of the water. And there'll be power limits and certain rules about what you can use. The big reform actually in this area came in '85 and '89. When a guy who's still around, Mike Marcus, no longer at the FCC, but he was an engineer there, and he actually got some loosening of the restrictions on what could be done with unlicensed spectrum so that spread spectrum devices could be used. And it just turns out that one open set of, there was a little bit more that went to it, but the opening up the technologies that could be deployed on unlicensed was a big thing, not immediately, but 10 years later, essentially in '99, when broadband, residential mass market broadband started coming in, and a wireless complement was thought to be a good idea. We used to, in our homes in the US, have this category 5 wiring, Cat 5 wiring, that would maybe send signals around, but wireless has a lot of advantages to not worrying about, wires and things. Anyway, so Wi-Fi came in because the rules were liberal enough under the unlicensed regime that they didn't have to get permission. Those non-exclusive rights became very, very popular. And some other stuff, comes in under that, like Bluetooth. And again, these are all basically local area networks that they work without wide area. I mean, a national or international mobile network, you can see there's a lot of efficiency to having ownership of the radio spectrum and not worrying about local landowners or local people. Fragmentation like that would kill sort of the aggregation of the system. But when you have a local kind of situation for use, just powering down and keeping people localized like that might be enough. And so that's actually worked fairly well. Some people call it spectrum commons or shared spectrum, but all this spectrum is shared. Okay, I'm on AT&T. When I go on the AT&T, I'm sharing it with over 130 million other Americans. So that's intense sharing. And in fact, I'm sharing base stations, not just the spectrum. That's the base stations and the networks. And it's very, very important. So at any rate, there are a lot of popular apps that are on the, and the notable bands here are on the unlicensed 2.4 and 5.8. Now 5.8, as you might suspect, is next door to 5.9. And so that makes it kind of economical to maybe just combine some 5.9 with 5.8 and get more for unlicensed. And that's kind of what the argument was. Now I'm not going to go through this licensed, unlicensed. I've got some citations and other stuff in here, but oops. Okay. The important thing here is just this. This 5.9 has turned into a battle between two competing non-exclusive uses. Okay, nobody's got the property rights to be able to say, okay, we tried this, we're going to cancel that out, we're going to do something else. And just to give you an example of how that secondary market worked, and this is another answer to Francois's question. So in 2002, 2004, and then finally 2008, the FCC was actually, it knew that it had over-allocated television spectrum. Over-the-air television has been a vestigial organ. You know the term vestigial organ, your appendix? We still have them, but they don't do much. Anyway, since at least 2000, when someone started writing papers about what are we going to do with the TV spectrum, it's a huge chunk of very valuable stuff, but it's over-the-air broadcasting. We have cable and satellite. Of course, now we have broadband and over the top. Why do we set this aside for what was a an important technology in 1952 in terms of distribution. So so the FCC, slowly, but to its credit, even during the 1990s, they recognized this, and about the mid 90s, they started a program to try to reallocate more of the TV band to mobile. So they started some auctions. They had some stuff scheduled in 2002, 2004, where they actually turned around channel 55, TV channel 55, UHF channel 55. And then finally they got a few of them out, and then finally in 2008, they got the rest of them out. Meaning companies like Qualcomm could go and buy a license to use channel 55, and they didn't have to do television. They were given flexible use. Well, Qualcomm had a thing called media flow. And media flow in that period of time was a very radical idea. You watch television on your phone. Shake your head, because that's not to you a radical idea, I know. In fact, yes, if I ask my daughter, you watch TV this week, they say, yeah, I'm watching it right now, I'm watching Netflix. So yeah, but then it was kind of an interesting idea. The actual internet speeds were not, and particularly wireless, wasn't enough to really do what we do now. This is the mid 2000s. So Qualcomm had a technology that it created, and it bought some licenses to test its technology, wanted to take it all over the world. And what they did was they turned these TV stations around, channel 55, and they actually paid some of the TV stations that were broadcasting on to go off the air. And they started a network, about 2007, 2008, called Media Flow. And you could pick up, there were some carriers, like Verizon carried it. On some phones you could get it. It was 21 channels of television, like CNN or I don't know, Disney or who else was on there, but it was like 21 cable TV channels on your phone. Again, I know that you're way ahead of me on this because the markets move forward, but that was the radical idea. And they were having trouble selling. And they spent about $1 billion, which was both the technology and what they spent on the auctions and then the marketing and all that rollout. By 2010, they decided it wasn't going to work, and they took it. They wrapped up their spectrum and they sold it to AT&T for, was it 4G? I think it was 4G was being built. It was at least 3G. And that's a rational allocation, okay? They had something innovative. They tried to provide it, tested in the market. They spent $1 billion on it. It didn't work. They ended up getting about $2 billion, I think, for the licenses. Nobody got killed or fired in San Diego. And to my knowledge, but at any rate, that's exactly the way you want that to work. You don't want it to take 100 years of a regulatory agency. You want people to go in to do something, and then, because they had flexible use property rights, they could go in, they could try their idea. If it doesn't work, they can turn it around, and it doesn't take a 20-year Washington proceeding. So that's not happening here. That can't happen here. Why? Because the rights are not in the marketplace, so to speak. They're at the regulatory agency. So this is what you got competing. Anyway, this is just how you get $4 billion out of this, but it's on the paper what the other valuations are. And this is what they did, just 75 megahertz, not that interesting. They divided, the FCC divided it up into 7 10 megahertz channels and then a 5 megahertz control channel. Here's the only interesting part was the timeline. And the only interesting part about this is that the whole process has taken 23 years, basically, to go from the petition filed to have the FCC actually move forward, even though the Congress had said, you should take a look at this. There was a petition that started the official process at the regulator 1997, and then in November 2020, the FCC did say, yeah, it didn't really work well that way. So 23 years later, we're going to open up 45 out of the 75. And so that's where we sit now. I don't want to totally kill the clock here, but here's what the FCC did when it reallocated. And it did a cost benefit analysis. So it's a lot of this on the slide. And there are a lot of problems with the cost benefit analysis, but let me just say right off the bat, I'm very happy the FCC made this explicit and transparent. And obviously, we want that in general. We want, one of the problems you have here is that you just have interests and insiders and not a lot of real critical scrutiny that the, you know, a lot of public interest should probably revolve around, and it's hard to tell what the regulators are doing. Here they actually did it. Now, nobody seems to be much interested that, you know, it's not got a piece of this and sort of wants to throw down with the regulators and what they did. I haven't heard any real critiques, but there's some real problems with the way this cost benefit analysis worked. Anyway, there's two basic things that the FCC did. One, they said, if we allocate 45 out of 75, and they're obviously the internet companies wanted 75, but anyway, so the FCC starts with kind of a split on this. There were companies, there was a foundation, New America, I believe, that said this, and then also Qualcomm, I believe, also was one of the companies that said, oh, why don't you think about 45-75? That probably has more political resonance than, you know, technical or economic significance. But anyway, this is what the FCC did. Suppose we add 45 megahertz to the unlicensed allocations. Now, they said if we do that, we can do a little razzle dazzle to find out that we have bigger channels. We have more channels that are 20 megahertz. We can get 3 more of these 20 megahertz channel. We can get 2 more of the 40 megahertz channels, 1 more of the 80, and 1 more of the big 160. These bigger channels, wider channels, they're just faster in terms of what they accommodate. But at any rate, all they did was say, this is the weighted average, well, they're just taking a weighted average here. So this is the amount of existing traffic that goes over these existing channels. And they say, if you put more of these channels in there, this is how much extra traffic you're going to get because of the bigger channels. Now, I'm not an engineer, but I do know this: 45 megahertz is about 2% of the total unlicensed allocation as we sit here. Now, 1,000 was just added in the 6 gigahertz block this last year, just before this cost benefit study was published. So that's in there, but you can say that's new. Anyway, the fact is that normally the FCC, I say normally, they do it all the time with mergers of mobile companies. They say how much spectrum is being combined. They don't say how many channels are being combined. They don't use some other methodology about trying to figure out some technical way to do this. This makes it look like there's a huge increase when 45 megahertz is 2% of the existing 2,000 megahertz allocation. So they pumped up the magnitude by 4 by going this way. Maybe an engineer says, no, they did it exactly the right way. I don't know. It's interesting. And it's interesting that it differs with their methodology elsewhere. That's very standard in terms of saying if a company that has licenses covering 130 megahertz merges with a company with licenses covering 90 megahertz, now we consider them having 220 megahertz. We just add it up, and in general, they don't make adjustments for where it is, except if it's way high millimeter wave. There's some tweaks that they could do, some nudges, but this is a different methodology, and it's of course highly suspicious when they do something like that without commenting on it. Now, so the first thing they tell you is right at the top that there's a 8.4% increase because these channels get bigger. If you just do the weighted average the way they've done it. Now they want to know how much revenue. Now they're going to say that value is revenue. That's also economically unsatisfying. We could go further into critique on that, but let's just say that's not exactly the way this is normally done. But they did make an effort here to put some economic numbers on this, and they wanted to value that 8.4% increase. And what they did was they took the amount of traffic that was projected to come in future years, 2023, 2024, 2025. This is total internet traffic in the US. This is the amount that Cisco says is from Wi-Fi. So you can see that more than half is Wi-Fi. if you have another 8.4% added onto this, this is the addition. These are like the extra bits you're getting because you have this extra Wi-Fi capacity. Now, that leaves something to the imagination here. That is to say, if you're not changing your home internet connection, but you're getting better throughput in your house, do you really get more bits? It's pretty hard to do that, but maybe there's a trick. They don't talk about that mismatch, which is a mismatch. But at any rate, forgetting about that, they end up being able to estimate, as I try to describe in the paper here, they estimate how much extra gigabytes the average home would actually consume, and they put a price on the gigabytes by seeing how much. They start with how much people are paying for data usage per household. This is the actual gigabytes per month that they've estimated, and in the paper they have about $80 a month is the current average price for broadband. That is back that here somehow. But at any rate, we come up with these estimated numbers of how much people would pay for their extra gigabytes they're getting, which they're getting through Wi-Fi, but not through their ISP. And they actually use the ISP price. So here's the real thing that I fell off my chair with. They said you're getting faster Wi-Fi at home, you can have more bits. There's a mismatch to how that can happen when you don't increase your capacity over the Comcast or Verizon connection, but just go with that for a moment. How much more is, I mean, if you could go from, if you could, have an 8.4% increase in the amount of bits flowing around your house, how much is that worth to you? They said, we're going to value it at what you pay for the bits you paid monthly to Comcast. But that's not the same service. That's not close to the same service. That's like saying a bus trip from Santa Monica to Venice is proxied by an American Airlines flight from LAX to Chicago O'Hare. I mean, they're both transportation. They're both transporting people. But the wide area networks are doing something quite different, obviously more expensive than what you can do locally. Now, it's not just that it's also that there's substitutes. There are other ways to substitute. If you want faster home Wi-Fi, you can certainly substitute with a better Wi-Fi system at home, as many of us have. If we buy Eero or something like that, you just, you spend more on a better, you put more relays or base stations at home. You don't need extra spectrum to do it to get your 8.4%.
So is there a discussion that also this might shift use of lower Wi-Fi bands to other users? Meaning this makes more sense for residential, or maybe 2.4 makes more sense.
Well, what they're saying is that these bands are going to open up and get as much traffic instantly. I mean, it's another sort of set of assumptions that's very strong, but spend a lot of time on it. They say instantly they'll get as much traffic as the other bands. Usually it takes a long time to fill in, you need devices and everything else, but okay, so but they're making very strong assumptions that all this traffic fills in, just like this, and so the 8.4 just immediately fills up the way the other bands have.
Right, right. My question is more, is there in the analysis or in the discussion a sense that if this bands open up for residential, 2.4 may grow to some other
Yeah.
use that makes more sense,
Right.
and
Well,
then you
yeah.
have to revalue the band.
Well, sure, yeah. Yeah, they don't go that route. I mean, they say, look, this is the current throughput. We're going to add 8.4% by this other technical kind of calculation that may or may not make any sense. But 8.4%, and how do we value an increase of 8.4%? Well, let's just say that these bits are worth what people are paying to the ISP. which is an analogy, but a very, very weak one. And of course, you got, look, there are some, usually with your ISP service, you get a free Wi-Fi router. Sometimes you actually can find prices where they say you want a Wi-Fi router, it's $5. Sometimes they charge. So you might think, well, $80 versus $5 might be some kind of, and it might be if they want to start doing this, but it's not really, it's not $5 here. It's the increment to get you 8% more, according to their estimate, 8% more throughput. How much does that 8% more throughput cost you? It would be something on top of the $5 a month you would be paying to get 8% more. And presumably it would be something less than $5 because you just get a slightly better.
So then when they get that number, what do they do with it? Is that a way
They
to-
multiply that times the 8.4%, which has been translated from a percentage to bits. And they break this down, you know, these are the billions of gigabytes.
But that's as a way to value the transition from ITS to Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
And saying therefore,
Yeah.
that's the subsidy we need to give to the car companies so they get off.
Well, they're saying, well, so what they end up doing, so at the end of the day here, they say, this is, if we add this all up, we're gonna get about $7 billion a year. Well, we're gonna discount to 2020. So these are the 2023 to 2025 numbers. So about $6 billion a year present value in 2020 is what we're gonna get if we do this. And what's the cost? Okay, so the other part of this that set my hair on fire was besides using the ISP prices for a Wi-Fi increment, and it's an average price, which is another problem, but anyway, it's an average price they're taking to get the marginal of a different service. It's quite a different cost structure, but at any rate, they say, what's the opportunity cost? The opportunity cost is that the existing chips that have been built, and there are some, to use the 75 megahertz for ITS/DSRC, those chips have to incorporate the fact that they can't use 75, they can only do 30. And that's it. And the FCC looked at some numbers that were submitted by the car companies and said, oh, this is going to cost hundreds of millions. And they dismiss that as chutzpah and say, really, we think it's de minimis. And there's no real opportunity cost there. So even if you chop these numbers down to like a third, they say, you got it down to $2 billion a year, it'd still be great to do this because we got no opportunity cost essentially. Just these chips have to be, you know, and going forward is when all the action is because there's nothing happening now. So that's it. But okay, at the end of the day, you're left with the idea that the FCC has admitted that the 30 megahertz really isn't providing value. We don't expect it, you know, well, what they expect. It's never gotten there after 20 years, and we're going to leave 30 there as a political compromise. They don't say that, but we're going to leave 30 megahertz there. We're going to take 45 out and allow it to do what we say is this high value stuff. Now, of course, if that really were the marginal gain, you'd probably say, well, take the whole 75, or as I say in the paper, what about other opportunities? What about 5G? What would people pay for 5G? Now, I said before that $4 billion is about what you get. You know, the approximation of what you get if you auction it off. You say, well, that's only $4 billion. They get more than that. No. First of all, that's what companies bidding in the marketplace would pay. It's very routine, and the FCC has cited this many times, that those of us who have made empirical estimates of this, the producer surplus, which is what is reflected in the bids for the spectrum rights, that is a small fraction of total social value. The consumer surplus on top of that is usually at least an order of magnitude, 10 to 1. So if you have something like a $4 billion band, it's customary, and again, FCC believes this, and you know, they cited the work I'm referring to, some of which is my own, but it would be about $4 billion a year for consumer surplus. That would be just an approximation to you know, starting approximation. So I'm not saying that I know what the answer is, quite the reverse. I don't, it's a very tough one. That's why I like options of flexible use rights that allow this stuff to get distributed and then redistributed in a flexible environment where you get the, trial and error, helping you to find out where this stuff really should be used. So, that's kind of where we sit. The FCC went ahead and did this. I think the cost benefit analysis can be improved upon. Let's just put it that way. I am stunned that they used some of the proxies they used and some of the very strong assumptions, and that there was no more, not stunned, but the fact that there wasn't more feedback tells you how little real discussion there was in terms of social optimization. That you had two interest groups, well defined, well articulate in their own and able to use their own levers. And that drags things out when you have a pretty equal battle like that. It did drag it out for a long time, and then you get a split, 45-30. So if the FCC is really serious about this, they probably should allow that other 30 megahertz to go somewhere at least. And I would say they should allow the whole 75 to be wrapped up in some way that allows Comcast and Google and Microsoft to bid on it, and allows the car companies to bid on it as well, or T-Mobile and Verizon and so forth, or other players. So yeah. So these are just the errors and omissions. Already talked about that. And that's it.
Thank you, Don. We're a bit late, but I think we have a few minutes for questions if there's any follow-up. I think we've
One is that it's kind of interesting, even in their cost benefit analysis that you're describing, on one side, the cost, the opportunity cost, they're valuing that based on the hardware that's complementary to using the spectrum. And on the benefit side, they're valuing that on the price services a bit, which
yeah, well, yeah, and I'm sort of figuratively screaming about the fact that they're using a service price that's for a different service.
Yeah.
Wide area networks are like local area networks, but of course, as I say, it's a bus ticket versus a plane ticket, or which is why it's a lot easier.
It's even different. It's like the price of the car versus the price of the service.
Mhm.
In the two, they're not even
Yeah.
comparable.
Well, yeah, and where you really get into this a lot, and I cited this in a previous paper that talks about the evaluation studies at Spectrum that I wrote with an engineer, Mike Honig, but in intellectual property cases. So there was a case in 2013, I believe, about some patent essential technologies and in Wi-Fi. And so there were some owners of part of the radio interface and Wi-Fi that said that they hadn't been paid enough and that there was infringement by other players. I think they must have won the case because the judge was considering their claims, but said, look, you can't just add up all the things that are, all the devices that have Wi-Fi in it and say you get some slice of the retail price of that. There's a whole bunch of, you're at the margin. Okay, so it's like, you can't say the radio manufacturer gets to say, oh, there's a radio in the new car, and so we get 2% of the new car price. So there were actually some good examples where the judge ran through to say you can't, you got to take your small slice on the increment of what your contribution is doing here. And again, that's the FCC is just losing that margin all over the place when they say that, we're going to say, okay, there's an 8% increase in total bits, and we're going to value that at what people are paying for, which is an average price, per bit for their services. There's no marginal valuation taking place, and there's no marginal contribution they're really looking at. So anyway, they would kick back a little bit, but anyway, that's where the debate should be.
Was there ever discussion about the tier system that's being used for 3.5?
Was there a debate about it?
to use that on 6.
Oh, yeah, and I didn't see it. That's interesting, yeah. You know, where the car companies would have priority,
Right, yeah, some sort of.
and then
tier
Wi-Fi
system.
could come in on top of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it reflects the fact that the Wi-Fi interests thought that they had a clean shot at it, and they wouldn't have to do that. And, you know, sort of at the end of the day, you can say, yeah, they were right about that. And there was, you know, sort of watching it from afar, it seems like they had, you know, they had the thing pretty wired. They had a good argument in terms of, you know, if you limit this to the car stuff in 5.9 or Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi is going to get more use. And that's, you know, so, and if you can keep 5G out of the discussion or satellite or anything else, then, you know, they were able to do that. And we got this being kind of the trade-off. And the FCC kind of, you know, gave them a cost benefit study that was very favorable. By the way, there were a couple of consulting reports done that had huge numbers for the benefits of Wi-Fi. And they were put out by, one was paid for by Comcast, it was done by the RAND Corporation, another one was done by Wi-Forward, which is, you know, Wi-Fi trade group. And they had huge numbers. And the FCC set, and they were part of this discussion. The FCC set them aside and said, you know, numbers are pretty, they wanted, I mean, they had like $170 billion a year. That's not the stuff. The FCC comes up with, you know, $6 billion. Okay. So you can tell that the FCC is kind of that. I mean, that's just too far. We'll set that, you know, we'll set that aside. But they used a lot of the methodology that they got there. This is the industry signaling the regulators. Here's how you do this. And so I'm sure the money was well spent from the standpoint of the industry that thought that it was, you know, I think they were influential to the regulators, and, you know, they're happy with that came out. But there were, you know, there were numerous outrages, analytical outrages made in those. The one that I love in the RAND Corporation studies, they actually said, how much is, what's the supply side? What's the, what are the companies going to benefit by using this extra spectrum for Wi-Fi? And they literally went to auctions for flexible use exclusive rights. And not only do they forget you have to make an adjustment for the fact this is 5.9 and the megahertz are less than what had happened, or a different number than what had happened before, but they went back to the 2017 so-called incentive auction, the forward auction that took the TV spectrum and put it out. T-Mobile was a big bidder in that auction. At any rate, they went back to 2017 and used that price tag of about $18 billion to say that this was the value, the supply side value of the spectrum, without ever acknowledging the fact that that's exactly the reverse of what's happening here. If you don't have the flexible use exclusive rights, and you have power limits and restrictions that are not part of that scheme. So this is it. You know, this is forgetting what the debate is and then using arguments from a different debate so that was a RAND Corporation study. So they added that to these other benefits they calculated. They got these numbers that were, you know, up to and over $100 billion a year. Again, those are obviously large because the FCC is perfectly willing to settle on $6 billion a year. But so there's look, tell your students there's a lot of work to do out there. And if you want to write some interesting papers, you know, deconstruct a lot of what's going on in the regulatory world and you know, sort of the feeder streams into that from consulting and you know, various studies, and you know, improve upon the process. There's certainly you may not, you know, in some cases you may not be the most popular person at the picnic, but you know, you certainly have something to contribute to doing a good analysis of social welfare.
That's a great conclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Thank you for your presentation. Also, it's a message for our colleagues and the other, the journalism colleagues who often pick up those numbers and publish them as if they were the revealed truth. But thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody. Again, I'm delighted this was our first experiment with in-person. We work well. We have
Nobody
lunch.
died.
We are here.
We don't know yet.
encouraging, very encouraging to looking forward next semester. This is our last summer of the semester, but we're looking forward to doing more in person. The weather helps. I mean, this was extraordinary, but in Southern California, we have to take advantage of this. So hopefully we'll do more of this hybrid in session. No, we didn't have anybody on Zoom, but I'm hoping to be able to do this type of hybrid. So thank you, Tom, again, and thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you hopefully soon. Next semester, we have Fred here. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Amigo. So you running the broadband study or what? Develop the broadband. Is that